In this episode, I will talk about the most important river in northern China, the Yellow River, and especially the middle sections of the river from which the early Chinese dynasties were based. The river starts in the Tibetan Plateau, and its eastward path is immediately blocked by mountains, forcing it to flow north all the way to the border of the steppes, where it bends east and then south. From here, the river is firmly stuck between hills and mountains and has nowhere to go except directly south, through a series of canyons and gorges, including the waterfalls at Hukou. It then encounters a flat area along the Fin and Wei rivers, but its path is then blocked off by the Qinling Mountains, so now it again turns eastward, through the final series of gorges along its path, and finally reaches the open plain. The Luo River feeds into the Yellow River at this juncture. Now on the wide open plain, the river meanders slowly towards the sea. This stretch of the river is extremely prone to flooding, and its course has changed many times during recorded Chinese history. About 2,500 years ago, instead of the straight, sharp turn that it currently makes, the Yellow River made a smooth turn and then flowed almost directly northwards. It transitioned into an enormous delta with multiple major channels and countless smaller channels. The entire delta was extremely marshy and therefore largely uninhabited. In modern times, the Yellow River is famous for two things: the extremely yellow color of its waters and its frequent catastrophic flooding, which, outside of China, gave the river the nickname China's Sorrow. The yellow sediments come mostly from the Loess Plateau, where the soils are soft and erode easily. The soils are deposited onto the lower plains, causing the riverbed to rise many meters above the surrounding lands and easily overflow their embankments during flooding. But even though the Yellow River has long been filled with silt and flooded easily, this was far less of a problem until about 1,000 years ago, after most of the forests on the Loess Plateau had been cut down. The lower banks of the river used to be far more stable and far more navigable. Even the name Yellow River, in Chinese 黄河, did not become the standard name for the river until about 1,300 years ago. Before that, it was often known as 大河, the Great River, or simply 河, the river. The area northeast of where the river bends historically was called Hedong, meaning east of the river. Hedong was centered around the Fin River Valley. Downstream was Henan, south of the river. Today, Henan is the name of an entire province, but originally, it was just the lands immediately to the south of the river, around the valleys of the Luo and Yi rivers. And further downstream, as the river bent northward, it enclosed a strip of land against the Taihang Mountains. This was Henei, inside the river. Of the three regions, Henei had excellent soils and was usually the wealthiest and most populated, but because it was on the open plains, it was vulnerable to floods and invading armies. Hedong had mediocre soils but all kinds of natural resources: forests, copper, iron, and most importantly, salt, from a salt lake that is still producing salt to this very day. Hedong was well protected by mountains, but for this reason was also geographically quite isolated. Henan combined the advantages of the other two regions. It was centrally located, well protected by mountains, and crossed by many roads. But it was also the smallest of the three regions. To the west of all this was Hexi, west of the river, centered around the Wei River Valley. For Neolithic civilizations migrating from further inland into the valleys of the Yellow River, Hexi was a popular stopping point before moving further east. The early history of China can be told by combining two narratives: an archaeological narrative and a historical narrative. In the modern archaeological narrative, many ancient civilizations were scattered throughout the land, and they combined to form Chinese civilization after many centuries of migrations, wars, and intermarriages. In the traditional narrative, which has been in place for thousands of years, China was founded by a series of mythical rulers based out of the Yellow River valleys. Their descendants established the first dynasties, which then spread Chinese civilization by conquering the surrounding barbarians. Three of the earliest Chinese monarchs were Yao, Shun, and Yu. Before becoming monarch, Yu toiled for 13 years to build water projects against floods on the Yellow River. Yu founded the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia dynasty. It is still controversial whether or not the Xia dynasty truly existed. There are many archaeological sites that may have been Xia, but no writing from these sites to confirm their identities. Xia was supposed to have ruled for 400 years, from 2000 BC to 1600 BC. Xia was conquered by the Shang Dynasty, which ruled from around 1600 to 1045 BC. Shang originated in the east and, after moving around for a few centuries, built their capital at Zhaoge. Here, archaeologists have excavated countless oracle bones, used for divination, and the earliest written Chinese discovered. The Shang were a warlike people that ruled over many subjugated tribes. Around 1045 BC, one of these tribes, Zhou, organized an alliance against Shang and destroyed it. The Zhou capital was in Hexi, near the modern-day city of Xi'an. The original Zhou lands, the lands around the capital, were under the direct control of their kings. This region was referred to as Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom. In more recent centuries, the meaning of Zhongguo changed to not just the land around the capital, but China as a whole. Outside of the Middle Kingdom were many vassal states. Some were comprised of allied tribes, and others were new colonies established by members of the Zhou royal family. These states were tasked with assimilating the conquered territories, expanding further against hostile tribes, and coming to the king's aid when needed. Still further out were barbarians, collectively divided into 4 groups: Yi to the east, Di to the north, Rong to the west, and Man to the south. In 771 BC, the Zhou capital was sacked by barbarians, and the capital was re-established further east, near the modern-day city of Luoyang. The Middle Kingdom was re-established around this area, but by then, the Zhou kings had lost authority over the states, who began waging wars against one another. From 771 to 476 BC was the spring and autumn period. During this time, wars were usually quite limited, with rival states trying to establish hegemony over one another rather than conquest. Because the states were still subject to the king, it was fairly taboo for one state to outright annex another. But as time went on, the wars became larger and more aggressive, and by the Warring States period, 476 BC to 221 BC, the wars started to involve almost all of a state's resources and were fought with the explicit goals of conquest and annexation. This period ended in 221 BC, when the state of Qin conquered all of its rivals and unified China. During these time periods, one of the most prominent states was Jin. It was established around 1000 BC by the younger brother of the king as a border march against the Rong and Di barbarians. These were mostly semi-nomadic farmers who migrated from one place to another in search of new land. China was still sparsely populated at the time, with vast areas of uninhabited wilderness separating individual settlements from one another, so it was fairly easy for tribes to move into these areas. In its early days, Jin was surrounded by hostile tribes in the mountains and fought hard for its survival. But after 5 centuries, it subdued these tribes, partly through war and partly through alliances in which these tribes eventually became Jin subjects. Jin became the dominant power in Hedong. To the south, Jin encountered an early rival, a small state named Guo, strategically located to control the major east-west road as well as a few key forts across the Yellow River. The northern flank of Guo was protected by a small ally, a state named Yu, that occupied the mountain pass through the Zhongtiao Mountains. In 658 BC, the Duke of Jin bribed the ruler of Yu, convincing him to allow the Jin army safe passage. The Jin army subsequently conquered the north bank of the river. 3 years later, Jin again asked for safe passage through Yu. One of the ministers of Yu vehemently opposed the plan, arguing that the two states, Yu and Guo, were close, like lip and teeth, and when the lip is gone, the teeth will freeze. His advice was ignored. The Jin army passed through Yu, crossed the river, and conquered Guo. On its triumphant return home, it attacked Yu and conquered it too. This story was the origin of a Chinese idiom, 唇亡齿寒. When the lip is gone, the teeth freezes. It also gave name to a classic Chinese strategy, 假图伐国, obtain safe passage to conquer Guo. To the west, Jin crossed the Yellow River and conquered all the lands between the Luo and Yellow Rivers. Here it was not so lucky. Its westward expansion threatened the state of Qin, based out of the western part of the Wei River Valley. In 645 BC, Jin was forced back east of the Yellow River by the Qin army. To the southeast, a narrow gap separates the Zhongtiao Mountains from the Wangwu Mountains. The Chinese word for a gap like this through the mountains is xing. This path was named Zhiguanxing, zhi meaning the axle on a chariot, because even at its narrowest point, the road built through it was still wide enough for a chariot to pass through. The area was initially occupied by the Di barbarians, but was conquered by Jin in the 600s BC. To the east, Jin advanced into the highlands bordered by the Wangwu, Taiyue, and Taihang mountains. To the inhabitants living in the valleys below, this area loomed high above their heads, almost part of heaven itself, and so named it Shangdong, literally, in the company of heaven. Shangdong was hilly and had poor soil, but controlled the high grounds overlooking the surrounding regions. Jin expanded into Shangdong, and from here opened up 2 more paths through the mountains, Taihang Xing, and the much steeper, narrower Baixing. Parts of the Baixing has been in continuous use for over 2,500 years to the present day. Marching out of these mountain passes, the Jin army launched numerous military expeditions to establish hegemony over the small states in the Central Plains. For most of the 500s BC, Jin was the preeminent superpower in all of China. It controlled some of the best farmlands in China and was also an early pioneer in iron production. And unlike most of its major rivals, it claimed direct royal descent from the Zhou monarchy itself, and so saw itself as a protector of the existing social order during a time of increasing chaos. But unfortunately for Jin, its politics were controlled by noble factions that grew increasingly powerful, and the dukes became mere puppets. In the 400s BC, the 3 main noble houses were Zhao, which was based out of the far north, Han, and Wei. The 3 houses divided up the Jin lands between themselves. All that was left of Jin was a rump state surrounding the capital, and this too was annexed in 376 BC. The last Duke of Jin was deposed. China was now in the height of the Warring States period, and all 3 successor states to Jin, Han, Zhao, and Wei, threw their armies into the fighting to become the dominant power in China. Next time, I will talk more about the fate of these 3 states.